We've gotten to chapter 4 in our study of biblical history, the story of God's people in the Bible. And we ended last week looking at Abraham. We saw that God split the human race into nations, into family groups, and worked in those groups in unique ways. And some of them stayed true to God longer than others did, but all of them ultimately fell away into some kind of error. Polytheism, animism, spiritism, whatever it was. But the one nation, just as there was one man before the flood who stayed true to God, when every other man went his own way, there was one nation that God kept kind of against its will at times, in right relationship with him, gave them a proper understanding of who he was and how to serve him. And we know, of course, that the nation of Israel was not always faithful to God, but he was always faithful to them. He always brought them back. And the history of Israel gives us a really incredible picture of how God deals with us as individuals today. His faithfulness to us, the discipline that he brings into our lives to get our attention and bring us back to him. He made a covenant with the nation of Israel as a whole, and he makes a covenant with us as well. And our chapter today is entitled The Blood of the Covenant for that reason. And Israel had a very special place among the nations. Not only were they blessed in a special way, but they were to be a blessing. The whole world benefited from God's blessing of Israel. Psalm 67 says, God be gracious to us and bless us, and cause his face to shine upon us, Selah. And the us there is the nation of Israel. That your way may be known on the earth, your salvation among all nations. Let the peoples praise you, O God. Let all the peoples praise you. Let the nations be glad and sing for joy. For you will judge the peoples with uprightness and lead the nations on the earth. Selah. Let the peoples praise you, O God. Let all the peoples praise you. The earth has yielded its produce. God, our God, blesses us. God blesses us that all the ends of the earth may fear him. That was the attitude that Israel was meant to have. And oftentimes it went the other way. And you get people like Jonah, and even a lot of Jewish people nowadays that feel like God's attention to them is exclusive, and it means that he loves them and not other people. But the attitude of the psalmist was, God blesses us that all the ends of the earth may fear him. So Abraham started out in Ur of the Chaldeans, and a Chaldean is another name for a Babylonian. That's where the Babylonians were from. They were the Chaldeans as a people group, and it was called the Babylonian Empire because of their capital city, Babylon. But Abraham was related, at least, most likely, to the Babylonians themselves in their early days. And he lived in Ur and traveled quite a long way after God called him up to Haran, up kind of at that top point where the arrow goes. That's Haran, and stayed there for quite some time until his father died. And at that time he continued his journey down into Canaan. And you see some lines down all the way into Egypt and back. You'll remember that when there was a famine in the land of Israel, Abraham traveled down there as well. And that's where he got a lot of his riches. Let's go to Genesis chapter 15 and learn more about this covenant that God made with Abraham, who at this time was still called Abram. Genesis chapter 15. The idea of a covenant is very important in Israelite history and in the ancient world. A covenant was a very binding, unbreakable agreement between two groups or two people. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision, saying, "Do not fear, Abram. I am a shield to you. Your reward shall be very great." Abram said, "O Lord God, what will you give me, since I am childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus?" It was a while before this, quite a while before this, that God had given him the promise that he would make him the father of many nations. And Abram said, "Since you have given me no offspring, one born in my house is my heir." Then behold, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, "This man will not be your heir, but one who will come forth from your own body, he shall be your heir." And he took him outside and said, "Now look toward the heavens and count the stars, if you are able to count them." And he said to him, "So shall your descendants be." Then he, Abram, believed in the Lord, and he reckoned it to him as righteousness. And he said to him, "I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans, to give you this land to possess it." He said, "O Lord God, how may I know that I will possess it?" So he said to him, "Bring me a 3-year-old heifer, and 3-year-old female goat, and a 3-year-old ram, and a turtle dove, and a young pigeon." Then he brought all these things to him. Abram brought them to the Lord, and cut them in two, and laid each half opposite the other, but did not cut the birds. So this was not for a sacrifice here, this was for a covenant. He cut them in two and separated them, and the tradition would have been Abraham and whoever he was making the covenant with, in this case God, would pass between the animals together. The birds of prey came down upon the carcasses, and Abram drove them away. Now when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and behold, terror and great darkness fell upon him. God said to Abram, "Know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years. But I will also judge the nation whom they will serve, and afterward they will come out with many possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You will be buried at a good old age. Then in the 4th generation they will return here, for the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete." It came about when the sun had set that it was very dark, and behold, there appeared a smoking oven and a flaming torch, which passed between the pieces. And that's what the picture is of. The amazing thing God did here, instead of going through the pieces with Abram, he put Abram to sleep and went through the pieces with himself. That's the kind of covenant this was. It wasn't a covenant that God was making with Abram. It was a promise he was making to Abram. And that becomes very important later in the New Testament. Paul looks back on this and compares the promise that God made with the covenant, the conditional covenant he made with Israel later. This is a covenant that God makes with himself to bless Abram and to preserve his descendants. It says in verse 18, on that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your descendants I have given this land, from the river of Egypt as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, the Kenite and the Kenizzite and the Cadmonite and the Hittite and the Perizzite and the Rephaim and the Amorite and the Canaanite and the Girgashite and the Jebusite. So this covenant is not breakable by any failure on the nation of Israel's part. In the law, we're going to see there were conditions. If you do this, you will be blessed. If you do this, you will be cursed. I will do this if you obey, this if you disobey. This promise to Abraham is unconditional and eternal. But it did not get passed down to all of Abram's offspring. And we see that very clearly as we go through the book of Genesis. Would somebody like to look up 12, 1 through 3? And some others can get the next few passages ready if they want. All right. So how many children did Abraham have? I actually can't remember off the top of my head. The easy, quick answer is 2, but actually he had more after Isaac. The 2 that are a big deal that we know about from the story are Isaac and Ishmael. But Ishmael did not receive this promise, and God was very clear about that. It is through Isaac your descendants will be reckoned. Somebody read Genesis 26, 1 through 5. Mm-hmm. All right, so we see the covenant repeated in almost the same terms, right? I will make your descendants like the stars of the sky. They will be very numerous. Through them, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. Right? How many children did Isaac have? And this is easier. As far as we know, he did only have 2. Yeah. To which of those sons did the promise get passed down? Jacob. Very good. Genesis 28, 10 through 15.
Took one of his brothers' clay and put it under his head and lay down in that place. Then he had a dream, and behold, a ladder stood on the earth with its top touching heaven. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And behold, Yahweh stood above it and said, I am Yahweh, the God of your father, Abraham, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie, I will give it to you and to your seed. And your seed will also be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out behold, I am with you, and will keep you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land, so I will not forsake you until I have done what I have promised you.
We have the same promise repeated 3 times to 3 different people. And Ishmael doesn't have a part in this. Esau doesn't have a part in this. It's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And at that point, it is passed down to each of his sons. The entire family of Jacob received this promise. Again, that they would possess the land, that they would be very numerous, that all nations would be blessed through them. So the relationship between the patriarchs and Egypt is very interesting. As we remember, Abraham, during a famine, went down to Egypt because there was food there, and he ran into some trouble there. And even though it turned out okay for him, that was when he told Sarah to say, "You're my sister. Don't mention that you're my wife," and just got into some trouble with Pharaoh himself on account of that. Isaac was told not to go down to Egypt as Abraham had done. Actually, in that same passage that we read, God told Isaac during a famine, stay in Canaan. Do not go down to Egypt. But then, of course, later to Jacob, when Joseph was down in Egypt, God appears to him and says, do not be afraid to go down to Egypt. So that was where they always tended to drift. And the reason for that is the climate in Canaan versus the climate in Egypt. If you look very closely, and most of you might be too far away to tell, but in Egypt, of course, the Nile River and the little rivers that branch off of it in the Nile Delta are solid blue lines. Right? They're rivers that are permanent, that are always there, unless it's a really, really, really bad drought like you had in the days of Joseph. But up in Canaan, the Jordan River is permanent in the middle of the land, but there are hills on either side of the Jordan, and in those hills are all of these dotted blue lines going from side to side. Those are wadis. A wadi is a seasonal stream. There's a river there if it rains. And if it doesn't rain, there is not a river there. The land of Canaan was entirely dependent on the weather for its prosperity. The land of Egypt was more consistent. When there was a famine in Canaan, there was probably still food going to be found in Egypt. And this was very important in the later history of Israel as well. The Canaanites, this is why fertility rites and fertility gods were such a big deal in Canaan. Why they spent so much time worshiping gods like Baal, who were in charge of the weather, and along with fertility cults and deities, you get a lot of immoral behavior because of the association between fertility, of course, and human fertility, fertility of the ground. And so it's one of the reasons why the Canaanites were so corrupt, why their religion was so evil, but why it was the way it was, why it had that emphasis. And also why God put the Israelites in the land of Canaan. It was the perfect place for them, and why he set up the covenant the way he did. If they followed him, they would have rain. If they didn't follow him, he would bring against them the nations around them. They were surrounded by other nations on every side, except on, literally every side, even on the side of the Mediterranean Sea. The Philistines were over there, and Canaanites that they never succeeded in driving out. So they were in constant threat, and they were in constant threat of famine, because they were entirely dependent on the weather. It was an area that required faith to live in. And throughout the days of the prophets, actually, Egypt, faith in Egypt stood in contrast to faith in God. They were always looking back to Egypt in the way that we as Christians look back to the world, to the place we lived, to the habits we had before we came to Christ. So eventually, they did go down to Egypt, and the arrows in the previous page were the journeys of Joseph and then later Jacob to Egypt to live. Exodus 3, 1 through 8. We saw part of what God told Abraham is what we recognize happened later on in the book of Genesis. They stayed in Egypt for more or less 400 years. Before God appeared to Moses. And I'll go ahead and read this one. It says, "Now Moses was pasturing the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian." And we mentioned him a little bit last week as somebody who knew God, who worshiped the true God, even though he was not Jewish. "And Moses led the flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God." Horeb is another name for Mount Sinai. "The angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, yet the bush was not consumed. So Moses said, 'I must turn aside now and see this marvelous sight, why the bush is not burned up.' When the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, 'Moses, Moses.' And he said, 'Here I am.' And he said, 'Do not come near here. Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place which you are standing is holy ground.'" And this is another thing. We see this come up later when the Israelites come to this mountain. That was something God told Moses, "You'll lead the Israelites out and they will worship me at this mountain." The mountain was considered holy. The Israelites were not allowed to touch it. Even if an animal touched it, they would have to be shot and killed. The place where you're standing is holy ground. He said also, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." Then Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Even then, they had the understanding that if you saw God, you would die. And some people in the Judges who saw the angel of the Lord had this same reaction. They were afraid they were going to die because they had seen a manifestation of God. The Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have given heed to their cry because of their taskmasters, for I am aware of their sufferings. So I have come down to deliver them from the power of the Egyptians, and to bring them up from that land to a good and spacious land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanite and the Hittite and the Amorite and the Perizzite and the Hivite and the Jebusite. So after an incredibly long time, God shows up and says, okay, now I'm here to fulfill my promise that I made to your ancestors a long time ago, that had probably by that time almost faded from Israel's collective memory. And yet there were still those who believed that promise. There was still an anticipation. We know that from the fact that Joseph's bones, when Jacob died, his remains were carried straight to Canaan with great ceremony. But when Joseph died, his bones stayed in Egypt. But he said, don't bury me here. Hold on to my remains. When God keeps his promise and brings you back to the land of Canaan, take me with you and bury me there. And that is a promise that the Israelites kept. They brought the bones of Moses out, the bones of Joseph out with them from Egypt when they went and buried them in the land of Canaan when they finally got there in the time of Joshua. But there are a lot of different theories that people have come up with as far as the exact route that the Israelites took when they left Egypt and exactly where Mount Sinai was. And you see that reflected on this map. Some people think the green route, that they actually went through like the edge of the Mediterranean Sea to avoid the land of the Philistines up there. I don't see that at all. But there's another view. The blue line there, or purple or whatever it is, that goes across the Sinai Peninsula and down into Midian, you see, and puts the Mount of Horeb, Mount Sinai, in Midian. Do that based on the fact that Moses was living in Midian when he saw the burning bush. But we know from the example of other people in Scripture, like Joseph's brothers went a long way away from home as they were watching sheep. You can go a long way as a shepherd before coming home again. It was a very nomadic lifestyle. The traditional site for Mount Sinai is what you see the red line going to, right down in the middle of the triangle right there. And that's what most people believe, that that's the route that they traveled. And there is actually a monastery, a convent, built at the base of Mount Sinai, the traditional site, on the traditional site where Moses saw the burning bush. And you see that right there, down at the bottom of the mountain, and up on the side there, you see the traditional site of Mount Sinai itself. Let's go to Exodus. Our time is almost up here. And due to the constraints of time, let's skip this passage, at least for now, or let me sum it up really briefly. The Israelites came to the mountain where Moses had been told to lead them, to Mount Sinai. The presence of God came down on top of the mountain. There was thunder, there were earthquakes, everybody was terrified. God spoke to them directly, gave them what we call today the 10 Commandments. And as he got to the end of listing off the 10 commandments, the people were so done with this. They were so afraid. They cried to Moses, please don't let God speak to us anymore. You speak to God. You tell us what he says. We'll believe you. We just don't want God to talk to us anymore. This is too much. They were terrified. So Moses went up onto the mountain. God gave him more laws, many laws, and not all of the laws that God gave Moses were given to him on Mount Sinai. God continued to give him more as they wandered in the wilderness. And we see that in Numbers and even later on, Leviticus and Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is largely a recap, but there are a few new things in there that we didn't see before as well. God continued to reveal things to Moses. But this was a very significant turning point in how God used Israel, of course, in the history of Israel itself, but also in how he used Israel to show his righteousness to the surrounding nations. In order to fulfill God's plan for them, it wasn't enough for the Israelites to be a blessed people. They had to be a holy people. It had to be clear from looking at them that there was something different, that there was an explanation for their prosperity, and that explanation was that they followed God, that they served him instead of any other gods. And that had to be clear to the surrounding nations, or Israel would not truly be a blessing that they were supposed to be. So God provided Israel with a complete legal system, which he continued to expand, as I said, after they left Sinai. It was a lot more than just moral laws that he went over. He went over a lot of specifics in regard to how to worship him, the tabernacle, what to do in different social situations, legal situations that came up. And this is where I would like to start reading again and go into a little bit more detail, focus our attention, is in Exodus 24. Right, and let's get through it quickly. So this is a very key passage in the history of Israel in the Old Testament, because just as we saw God make a covenant with Abraham earlier, this is where God makes the covenant officially with the nation of Israel. Exodus 24. Then he said to Moses, come up to the Lord, you and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, who were Aaron's sons, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and you shall worship at a distance. Moses alone, however, shall come near to the Lord, but they shall not come near, nor shall the people come up with him. Then Moses came and recounted to the people all the words of the Lord and all the ordinances, and all the people answered with one voice and said, all the words which the Lord has spoken we will do. Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. Then he arose early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain with 12 pillars for the 12 tribes of Israel. He sent young men of the sons of Israel, and they offered burnt offerings and sacrificed young bulls as peace offerings to the Lord. Moses took half of the blood and put it in basins, and the other half of the blood he sprinkled on the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people, and they all said, all that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient. That was their saying, I do, in this covenant, validating it on their side. That was their agreement. God was going to be their God. They were going to be his people. It was a two-sided deal. So Moses took the blood and sprinkled it on the people and said, "Behold, the blood of the covenant, which the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words." So all the words God has said, his law, and all of the words that they have said, their commitments to obey. In accordance with all these words, he sprinkled the blood on them and said, "Behold, the blood of the covenant." And much later on, of course, we have Jesus use very similar words when he holds the cup at the Last Supper and says, "This is the new covenant in my blood." The new covenant replaced the old, and like the covenant that God made with Abraham, it was a covenant that God made himself. It wasn't the only condition for us to receive it, which was true of Abraham as well, is faith. And in setting up the new covenant, the old covenant was done away with, according to the author of Hebrews. And this is the covenant, the new covenant, that God wants all people, even Israelites, to live under today. And that brings us to the end of our time, and we will look a little bit more on what the covenant specifically entailed and how things played out in the history of Israel as they entered the promised land.